I'm going to attempt to cover a subject in half an hour, which is really not satisfactory because this is a subject on which you could probably talk for 3 or 4 hours and still have plenty of stuff to talk about. But I'm going to try to introduce you to inflammation and some ideas about it. Inflammation was first described by a dear old friend Hippocrates 2,000 odd years ago. Now, how many of you know that Hippocrates was more than one person? Some do. The Hippocratic writings were written over a period of some 400 years. So there's no way it could have been one person unless he was bloody good at anti-ageing medicine. And I don't think they were at that stage. So it's thought that the Hippocratic writings came from a number of people over a period of years. And they described inflammation, and most of you would have had this in medical school. I was taught this stuff in medical school, and I think most of you would have been too, that we define inflammation by rubor or redness, calor or heat, dolor or pain, tumour or swelling. And to these, a little later, some of the later people in medicine added loss of function. And it is a significant cause of tissue damage, and one of the major things that leads to degenerative and ageing changes in the body. Now, I want to look at this in a way that we're going to look at things like precursors, the things that predispose people to inflammatory problems, the triggers that will trigger off inflammatory problems, the mediators that are concerned in mediating the process, in other words, the things that keep the process going and drive it, and lastly, looking at how we can deal with these things. Now, if we look first at precursors, these are predisposing factors which may make inflammation more likely to occur. And first up, we've got a genetic predisposition, the modern Western diet, high sugar and refined carbohydrate intake, high intake of saturated fats and trans fats, low intake of omega-3 particularly and omega-6 fatty acids. Okay, so imbalances in diet in our modern Western diet which predisposes to these sort of problems. The metabolic syndrome. We have, according to our experts in government and everywhere else, a diabesity epidemic in the Western world. And it is indeed becoming a major problem. And the major underlying cause of these problems is metabolic syndrome. And this is also known as insulin resistance syndrome, as most of you will know. And most of these people, as well as having problems with handling sugars, problems with fats, problems with obesity, because of their high insulin levels, have increased inflammatory processes going on. This occurs largely because the elevated insulin stimulates CRP production and increases the inflammatory process. Chronic infections of any kind will predispose us because it presets the immune system to be overreactive. And last but not least, gut dysbiosis. More and more and more there is literature coming out saying that the central thing that we need to look at is what is going on in the gut. The naturopaths, if you talk to them, will say, oh, we've known that for years. The two things we look at are gut and liver. And they've been right. We've poo-pooed them, but they've been right. They haven't perhaps understood the things quite the right way, but they've certainly had some inkling of what's going on. And there is now an ever-increasing amount of evidence to show that dysbiosis, or an imbalance of the bacterial flora in the bowel from birth, can predispose us to a lot of conditions, and particularly immune conditions and inflammatory conditions. Because there is now evidence out there to say that if we load babies with the right bacteria, the correct bacteria in their gut, it will have a positive effect on setting their immune system so they are not overreactive, they don't produce these sort of problems. But if they do not have the right organisms, they are preset to run into these sort of problems later in life. So all of these things are important as precursors. The genetic components are things like autoimmune disease. We know these need a genetic marker, but over the years we've found that it also needs a trigger. How many of you know about molecular mimicry? Okay, those that don't, go and Google it. You'll find hundreds of references to molecular mimicry. The current thought with autoimmune disease is that molecular mimicry is what triggers it off, and this can be triggered by an infectious agent such as Candida in celiac disease and psoriasis, Coxsackie virus in IDDM, and also in IDDM cow's milk allergy. And there is a lot of literature out there that talks about this, and this is a very important process to understand. The modern Western diet, excessive calories and carbohydrate, leading to increased incidence of metabolic syndrome. Associated insulin levels increases CRP, adding to the inflammatory process. There is also an increased intake of saturated trans fats and omega-6 fats, which are all pro-inflammatory. Chronic infections will lead to increased immune activation and thus will lead to increased risk of inflammation generally. Gut dysbiosis. Disturbance of gut flora may lead to significant immune activation. 66% of the body's total immune cells reside in the gut wall, in the gullet and the malt. How many of you understand that and know that? Everybody? Few. The gut is not just a digestive organ, it is very much an immune organ, and that's the message we've got to get and we've got to learn. Thus the gut is very much an immune organ with immune activation levels very much infected by gut contents and flora. If we now look at the triggers that can trigger inflammation, and these can be infections such as viral, bacterial or fungal. They can be allergens, any kind of allergen, but especially food allergies because of their particular effect on the gut. Mechanical trauma, an inflammatory process, as you will be aware from your pathology, is part of the wound healing process, the normal wound healing process, if we have trauma. The mediators can be cellular, and these include neutrophils, lymphocytes, eosinophils, and there can be other things like cytokines. And the cytokines are becoming more and more obvious as a significant player in these sort of problems. These are basically chemical messenger molecules, basically intended to be used by the immune system to recruit other immune components to help deal with infections and whatever else might be going on. But they cause symptoms, and some of them cause significant inflammation. Cytokines can be either pro-inflammatory, and the ones that seem to be the major problem here are IL-1, interleukin-1, interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha. Or they can be anti-inflammatory, and these are interleukin-4, interleukin-10, interleukin-13 and TGF-beta. Cytokines mediate and control immune and inflammatory responses. Many of the symptoms seen in inflammation are caused either directly or indirectly by cytokines. Other mediators include prostanoids, the prostaglandins and leukotrienes. They're produced from essential fatty acids through the cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase pathways. You should all know this. If you don't, go and read it up and look at it and understand it. They can be pro-inflammatory, and this is prostaglandin E2 and leukotriene B4 are good examples, or anti-inflammatory prostanoids such as prostaglandin, should be E1. I cocked that up when I was doing this, and leukotriene B3. And they're responsible for a considerable part of the symptoms in inflammation. Now, they're commonly treated in medicine by using COX-1 or COX-2, cyclooxygenase 1 or cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitors.